Welcome to Asia. This will be the first in a series as we go through the different regions in Asia. This is our most populous area, so there's a lot going on. In general, let's do a quick overview of the area we're going to be dealing with. We've got it divided into some subregions, but we're going to see some commonalities. We're going to see colonial legacies here, like we saw in Africa, like we saw in the Americas. Some of it's language, some of it's corruption, some of it is political system. So we've got a little bit of everything in this area. Physical geography, we've got three main areas. We've got the inner highlands, which are sparsely populated, just simply because they can't support large populations. You've got the Tibetan Plateau, the Himalayas, the Taklamakan Desert, none of which are conducive to producing large amounts of food. So you don't typically, there's a few big Chinese cities, but for the most part, this is a very sparsely populated area. The river plains is where the bulk of the population lives because you've got fertile soils, water sources, flat areas for agricultural production. So this is where our large population densities are. And then you've got these offshore island groups, whether it's Japan, the Philippines, Indonesia, and some other scattered ones through here. These are quite varied in levels of development, economic activity, population densities. So there's even though we've got these three main physical areas, none of these areas really have anything in common because there is so much diversity in the area. The monsoonal climate happens when predominantly in South Asia and Southeast Asia. This is one of those climatic events where as the ITCZ shifts to the north, you don't have to know what that is. That's just a band of rain at the equator. It shifts to the north during June, July, August, and then it shifts to the south in December, January, February. Well, that band of rain, when it shifts to the north in the summertime, it brings the rain with it. And it comes that warm water coming off the Indian Ocean brings a lot of rain with it. So these are places that, if you notice, get rainfall in the amounts of almost 3 meters. That's a lot of rain in a very short amount of time. The winter time, the air is blowing offshore. It's coming off the continent. It's blowing towards where the rainfall is happening to the south. So that means you have a very distinctive wet season and dry season in it. This, because of the dry season, even though they get a lot of rain in the summertime, the winter time, the lack of rain can cause problems. And this is just a similar map. Um, I'm always fascinated by how you design and plan for an environment that gets that much rain. So things like high curbs like this. Jakarta, the capital of Indonesia, has spent billions of dollars on just a system to get the rainwater out of the city quicker than what had been happening. I mean, then it's just a matter of life. I mean, these kids are drenched, but you're going to get drenched. So what's the point of having an umbrella or trying to protect yourself? Now, population will always be a big issue in Asia simply because we have almost half the world's population in this area, 3 billion. That's just staggering number. And what's staggering about it is how these people live. We've got nomadic tribes living in a manner that's similar to the 1800s, to some of the most modern cities on earth. The largest metropolitan area in and around Shanghai at up to 50 million people. So there's a lot of diversity in how people live. But of that population, despite the diversity, most of them are in villages. And these are rural. They have some power, but most of it is farming activities. You're not creating a lot of economic development in those areas. So poverty will always be an issue throughout the area. The other thing with having 3 billion people is anytime you start talking about percentages, they're staggering. So if you've got the billion people in India and you have a 1% growth rate, 1% of a billion is 10 million. So that's bigger than the population of many countries. And in a 10-year period, you're adding 100 million people. Just the numbers become very much larger when you're dealing with the billions. And the same thing with if you say you've got 5% of your population doesn't have something or has something, these are very, very large numbers. Now with manufacturing, it's difficult because I'm almost going to have to and we get into different countries, what's going on because it is so varied. For those of you using Apple devices, those are the most modern technology we have, and it came from China. And then at the same time, China is producing some of the cheapest products on the market with low technology. And then you've got the other countries who are making a little bit of everything, from cottage industries where they make it for their own village to stuff that's sold on the international market. It's just, we're all over the place. The agriculture, it too is all over the place. Um, I'm not really going to go into commercial agriculture because I'm assuming you realize that commercial agriculture, it's run like a business. They have access to special seeds. They've got the money to buy large farm equipment. It's run on a large scale. So it's, the farmers are basically employees of the corporation. Those aren't that exciting. But the other types, we have plantation shifting and pastoral nomadism. I'll go through each one of those and what they're like. Plantation agriculture, we've talked about this when we were dealing with the Americas, where you're growing a crop that's sold on an international market. Nobody's growing coffee to consume locally. They're growing coffee to sell on the international market. And a little side note real quick, coffee beans have to be picked by hand. You can't automate it because each one of the beans ripens at a different rate. And so a machine so far hasn't been able to figure out a way to quickly determine which seeds are ripe or which beans are ripe and which ones aren't. But these are tropical crops. They grow in the low latitudes in and around the equator. Most of this is in Southeast Asia, but we are seeing, obviously, tea is a big export from India, but it's mostly Southeast Asia when we see this plantation agriculture, just because the climate's appropriate for that. Shifting agriculture, also called slash and burn, this you find in the tropical rainforests, where you've got the very, very thick vegetation of the rainforest, but you still want to farm it, which is kind of difficult if it's a rainforest, so you just burn the damn thing down. So the idea is you cut the trees, that's the slash of slash and burn. You burn the trees, they add nutrients to the soil, and then you farm it until the nutrients run out in the soil. The heavy rainfall of the tropical rainforest leaches, it removes the nutrients and rinses it out. And so without the constant dying plants of the rainforest that replenish the soils, you're going to run out of nutrients. And so you have to move to another place and start the process all over again. And so that's the shifting in shifting agriculture, is they're farming this area now, but when they depleted the soil here, they're just going to clear this forest, burn it, and then use it for a while, and then move over here and use it for a while. You can see some of these older scars where it started to regrow. And that would have been areas that in the past few years had been used. They're abandoned, and then they went somewhere else. Shifting agriculture works for small populations. It's not a negative in the rainforest. It's one of the better ways to utilize the rainforest. The problem with I almost called it slash and burn, that's the old name, shifting agriculture. The problem with it is that if you have a large population, then it becomes too much land is being cleared and it can't recover soon enough. So you end up with deforestation when you're cutting down large swaths of land, and you're getting deforestation when you're cutting down land for grazing animals and other commercial purposes. So it's fine on a small scale, not on a large scale. The drier areas, they don't have a lot of choice. You just simply, without water being brought in, your agricultural choices are limited. So you've got typically people with herds of animals, goats, cattle, what have you. They'll move from place to place depending on the seasons. So if you're in the mountainous area, you move up higher elevations during the summer, lower elevations during the winter. And then there's a north-south shifting too in the flatter areas and the desert areas. So here you're in Mongolia, and that's a yurt. They're actually using kind of this yurt technology, this yurt primitive technology for tourists. So if you go to Mongolia on vacation, there's a good chance that you might have the opportunity to stay in a yurt. Not on my list of things to do, but if you're in Mongolia, you have fun. Now, this is difficult for the governments because they don't produce a lot of cash, and typically they want to wander over national borders, which countries don't like. So they're starting to convert some of these groups to commercial agriculture, which they can bring in the water. And so in the background of this, you can see some green area. These are actually crops that were planted. And that's a problem because it totally changes the lifestyle. And it's kind of a cultural aspect of, do we disturb traditional practices that have gone on for a long time, or do we modernize and have a cash development for the country? Now, the most common and the one that feeds the largest number of people is what's referred to as intensive subsistence agriculture. The name is super descriptive. Intensive, it's a lot of freaking work, and subsistence is you're not really producing a surplus. You've got one or two crops that you may rotate throughout the year, but it's labor intensive because you don't have the money for power equipment. It's mostly manual labor, so you're not going to be producing as much as you would for an automated farming methods. So you're producing enough for your family and having enough seeds to replant the next year. So the subsistence is implying that you're just getting along from year to year. These people are very susceptible to changes in climate. If there's a drought, you may see starvation and famine. If it gets too warm, certain crops are going to have to change. So these people are on the edge. And so rice is always used as an example, mostly because that's the number one crop planted in this area and it feeds the most people. It has a high caloric output, but it's very labor intensive. You have to hand plant the stalks, they're hand harvested, they have to grow in water that's moving, but not too quickly. So the water has to be slowly passing through. So when you see these rice paddies, I just pointed with my finger at the screen, that's stupid. When you see these rice paddies, why they have them is it can regulate the water flowing from one to another, so it slowly moves through the system. Now the terraced paddies here, same thing. It's like the water will move down through the paddies in a very slow, deliberate manner. So you're not dedicating much land for animal grazing because you just can't spare the land or the labor. And then with animal grazing, if you're going to feed a cow 100 calories to get 10 calories out of it, it doesn't make much sense. So beef is not common in intensive subsistence diets. Pork and chicken is. They both can eat table scraps. They don't, and other agricultural waste. They don't take up much space. You can have a chicken coop, a pig pen, that's it. So in traditional, especially in China, traditional dishes, the pork and chicken are more common food ingredients. Let's look at our subregions of Asia, starting with South Asia. Not very many countries, but it's dominated by the number 2 in population in the world with India. Now, I mentioned that population issues are huge here as well. Obviously, I'm not going to make you memorize which the top 3 is or these specific numbers, but these are still staggering numbers for such a relatively small and a very, very poor area. Now, most of this area is in that second and third stage of the demographic transition. India is kind of moving towards the latter part of the third stage of the demographic transition. But when you're in these stages, remember that your population is growing really rapidly. And so these staggering numbers of adding 10 million per year is what we're seeing in India. And it's leveling off. But even with its growth by decade, when you're dealing with 20% growth over periods of time, it was only 50 years ago that they were at 430 million, and now they're over 1 billion in population. It's mostly in the rural areas, as you would expect, where the population growth is, where the urban areas where there's more job opportunities, there's women are in the workforce, there's other low population growth pressures. So the urban areas are not seeing the high growth rate the rural areas are. Now, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and India were a British colony, British India. The British had their typical colonial pattern where they would keep the local rulers in place and they just kind of place themselves above them in the process. They also kind of didn't like some of the practices that were done predominantly by the Hindus, such as what you're seeing here, the picture of the funeral pyre. And what would happen is that in some castes, when the husband died and his body was burned, the wife would throw herself onto the fire to be with the husband. And so they outlawed that. And the treatment of the untouchables, the Dalit class, some of those things, they put penalties of death for somebody just accidentally touching somebody of a higher caste. They outlawed those. They built an awesome road and rail network, as they did in Africa. And this was over a larger area, so it's been something that has helped the economic growth of the areas. They lost one of their cotton producing areas when the Americas gained their independence. And so they turned to India for cotton production. We still see that today, where most of the world's cotton comes from India. Well, World War II rolls around, and British kind of were thinking things would go back to the way they were before, but the colonies weren't having it anymore. They wanted their independence, and so it started with Pakistan and India got their independence, and I'll show on a map in just a second what happened. But it was based on religion. They basically put it to a vote of who wanted to go with the Muslim Pakistan and who wanted to go with the Hindu India. And with the exception of one region, they went with the majority. So if it was a majority Muslim, they became part of Pakistan. Majority Hindu, it became part of India. After the independence, we saw migrations of tens of millions of non-Muslims in Pakistan going to India and non-Hindus in India going to Pakistan, kind of reshuffling a little bit. Unfortunately, the way that Pakistan was divided between East Pakistan and West Pakistan, so that boundary between, rephrase that, the division between Pakistan with West Pakistan over here and East Pakistan over here was separated by India. Well, West Pakistan was getting all the economic development, all of the growth. This was the center of government. And so here we had an unhappy population because they were treated as second-class citizens. There was some protests. The Pakistani government was cracking down on them. So they were rebelling and wanted their independence. And so East Pakistan becomes Bangladesh. And that's where we end up with those three main countries in the process. Always evidence of British colonialism in their spread of Victorian architecture. Now, poverty is one of the main themes we'll see in this area. When you have 400 million people, it says earning less than $50 a year. Most of these people are just simply cashless, where it's barter, subsistence agriculture, or they're begging for money. So those are staggering numbers to deal with. So it's, as you'd expect, with high poverty rates and low income, that you've got a lot of low life expectancy. It doesn't help that a contributing factor to the poverty is their lack of arable land. There's just not enough land to farm to support this large population. And then when you have all of those villages with no truck access, even if you could produce a crop, how would you get it to market? India has been very active in building and improving their road network, but it's when you have 1 million villages, that's a lot of roads to build. I already mentioned the climate issues with the monsoonal rain. On the bright side, they've got cheap labor. We'll come back to that in a little bit. Construction techniques in this area always scare me. I'm always afraid to stay in a hotel when knowing how it was built. Once they got their independence, they had to develop their own industrial growth. As you'd expect, it's a colonial legacy. Why would you let your colony build their own stuff? Because then you don't need the host country. This is one of the reasons most countries wanted their independence, was to develop their own economy. The British tended to like the Hindus more than the Muslims. So if there was industrial development, there was a little bit in India. So they kind of had a head start, and they have more industry now. The textile industry obviously was one of the areas that was very strong and continues to be that. Now with India, their industrial development has just far outstretched Pakistan. They're trying to keep up with China in what they produce, and they make a little bit of everything, from nuclear bombs to scooters. So one of the major suppliers to the less developed countries of a main transportation device is India for their scooters. They actually sell, I think it's a Nissan manufactured in India, in Europe. There was always this race between China and India, who was going to be the first one to sell one of their own manufactured cars in either Europe or the United States. And India won the race to Europe, and China won the race to selling cars in the United States. obviously Hinduism and Islam dominate the religions of the area. Hinduism, the 97% of the world's Hindus live in India. And that doesn't mean 97% of the people in India are Hindu. It's just that that's where the Hindus are concentrated. There's a couple reasons for it, and I'll get to that in a second. The religion is polytheistic, multiple gods, and much of the religious practice is tied to your caste, which we'll talk about later, kind of your position in society, and as it relates to what you do in society. And with Hinduism, you're all over the charts as far as how somebody prays, when you pray, what type of religious activities you do. So there's not one single way to be a Hindu. There's multiple ways. And contrast that with Islam, where it's very, very rigid. The third religion we see in the area is an interesting one, Buddhism. This came out of the Hinduism that existed in around the 563 BC. This is the Hinduism then is different a little bit than what we see now. But the Buddha is a title. I don't think his friends called him Bud, they called him Sid. It's kind of a lifestyle that can be superimposed on other religions. So often you'll find people that are Buddhist and Shintoist, Buddhist and Taoist. It was adopted by a Chinese ruler, and it kind of migrated to the north in through Nepal and Bhutan and into China. So it's in the northern area of what we're talking about now, and then we'll see it again when we talk about China. And the Four Noble Truths, you don't have to memorize these, but the idea, if you look at these, that they're not something that is directly religious. I had a book once which I totally disagreed with, because there are other elements of Buddhism that are religious, that they were trying to say that it's not really a religion, it's a philosophy. And because of this, you can superimpose it and get it to merge with other religions. I have friends that I grew up with and I've known forever that were Christian Buddhists, and it was always interesting conversations around their house, how that worked. I always think my ex-wife needed to be a Buddhist because she always wanted stuff. So this is, if you're no longer wanting things, then you will no longer suffer. Some of the prayers, or some of the religious practices, revolve around ritual cleansing in the Ganges River, which scares the hell out of me simply because that river is so polluted. And here we can see the variation in the religious practices with predominantly Hinduism. The yellow is Islam, and then you've got the Buddhism superimposed in through here, and then even with you've got your trifecta of Confucianism, Taoism, Buddhism through here. It's always fascinating to me that just how different Islam and Hinduism is. Obviously the most basic one. Remember the emphasis that there's but one God, Allah, in Islam, and then you've got Hinduism, like, screw it, we've got hundreds of gods. We've got lots of idols. We've got lots of secret writings. We can do it all sorts of different ways. And then you've got the uniform dogma within Islam. The only thing I could find is that neither one will eat pork. But it's very, very different between those two religions. What happens, though, is in areas where you have a city that has a strong Muslim population and a strong Hindu population, it's not that they fight, it's just that they kind of interact in different circles. So the businesses they work with, the people they live near, so you've got like a Muslim area and a Hindu area, and they just kind of coexist in the city. Now, India and Pakistan have long fought over different issues, one of which is the water. That's important during the dry season in the Indus River Valley. But most of the conflict relates to the Kashmir region, Kashmir and Jammu. This area, when the vote came to be who would be part of India, who would be part of Pakistan, and by the way, I'm very much summarizing and abbreviating this. Like I said before, most of the area voted, every area but this area voted that if it was Muslim majority, Pakistan. If it was Hindu majority, India, except for this one. This one was a Muslim majority area with a Hindu leader, and so they went with India, and Pakistan disputes that. Well, one of the reasons they went with India is it's an old Silk route. So the trade between Europe and the trade between Asia also was a trade between South Asia as well. Well, the route to get into the Indian subcontinent went through this area. And so this part of India, which is the Kashmir region, had a lot of ties to the rest of India. And so that was kind of the background for that. They've disputed it. They've had some conflicts over it, armed conflicts. It kind of waxes and wanes with the leadership between the two countries, whether or not it becomes violent or not. They do have a very ritualized opening and closing of the border between the two countries. I totally insist that you guys watch it. It's fascinating, because you see kind of the Indian subcontinent versions of machismo, of who's more powerful, who's more mean. Becomes so ritualized now. It's become a spectacle that everybody comes to see. It's comedic, yet at the same time, there's lots of political implications going on. One of the new twists, I don't think it's in this particular video that I posted in Canvas, is that India is using female guards, which would never happen in the male military dominated Pakistan army. India, world's largest democracy. This is a huge democracy. This is important because things happen to benefit the greater society in India. They really are trying to improve their economic conditions. They're really trying to address poverty. But democracy is a slow process. We'll see things happen really quickly in China and really slowly in India. I already mentioned the population growth issues. I already mentioned they have a diverse economy, just re-emphasizing that. One of the things I like about India is they have a strong English-speaking population. They were in a former English colony. So a lot of jobs get outsourced to India because really cheap labor, and their English-speaking population is doing well. They've actually have lots of schools to teach people how to speak like an American, so people don't realize when they're talking to customer support or tech support that they're talking to India, because the person will use American slang. They're actually getting much better at it than they had in the past. I was tech support for my Dell, and I'm talking to the person, and like they had a weird accent. I couldn't place it because they used terms like y'all and contractions that you don't usually hear in formal English. And so I finally, when the call was over, I'm like, "Do you mind me asking where you're calling from?" And the woman starts laughing. She goes, "Well, I'm calling from India, but I went to school in Texas." I just thought that was funny. A lot of the growth in outsourcing to India happened 25 years ago, when they realized that the computer programs they'd written only had 2 slots for the year. So instead of it saying 1990 in the computer program, it would just say 90. Well, once we were going to get to the year 2000, the fear was that all the computer programs would look at it and say, "Oh my God, it's the year 1900 instead of the year 2000," because it was just going to have 00. So it was this Y2K bug, and tons of programs had to be rewritten quickly and fix this problem. So India kind of stepped up and did a lot of the reprogramming during that. So nowadays, if you've got computer programming, you can just outsource to India. It's like, I need this done. You can have it set up very, very quickly. My father-in-law's business, they do that. It's an insurance company. And they got rid of most of their staff and kept a handful of key programmers, simply because it was so much cheaper to send it off to India. The caste system in India is complicated, to say the least. I can't do it justice in a few seconds, but I'll try and just summarize it. It's a social structure where it's kind of what your position and what you do in life, where you've got the lower class laborers, the lower caste, laborers, and you've got merchants who are higher caste, and you've got warriors and rulers, your political leadership in a caste, and then you've got your religious at the very top of the caste system. You're born into it. If your father was a merchant, you will be a merchant. If you're going to marry, you will marry within that same caste as well. You live amongst that caste. So it's not something that's fluid and mobile. Your religious practices in Hinduism is tied to your caste. And so everybody within your caste shares the same practices. If you're a farming caste, maybe it's tied to the celebrations of the harvest. So it's it's part of who you are and your position in life. The top being the Brahmin, the religious caste, and then the bottom, they're actually technically not even in the caste system, they're below the caste system. The common term used by the West is the untouchables, but they're the Dalits. These are the ones that would be working with waste, um, removal of dead bodies, that kind of stuff. Very, very, very poor. And it's kind of into the culture where you've got a lower class citizen. Now, some of the rules about how the untouchables could be treated have been changed, and they're providing education to them. But it's if you've got a system where you've got an inherently underclass of population, they're still the poorest group of all of these. I mean, this is a Dalit neighborhood for you. Now, the caste system is breaking down in the cities simply because we don't have an automobile manufacturing caste. We don't have a cafeteria caste. And if everybody has to work together, you can't have a managerial caste if the managers are incompetent. Capitalism doesn't like that. So it's broken down a lot in the cities, but what we find is that for the most part, these guys all have 3 different jobs. They're all in the same caste, but they all still hang out together. They're more than likely going to marry within their caste still. So it's got the social remnants of it, but economically it's disappearing in the big cities. I've had 2 students who migrated from India in recent years. One came from a very, very rural area, and the caste system was very much in place there. And the other one, when I asked them about their caste system, and they were from Calcutta, they just kind of laughed at me and said, "No, we my parents are caste, my girlfriend's from the same caste, but that's about it for anything related to the caste. Nobody really cares anymore." But that was in the city versus the rural areas. Now, Pakistan, this is democratic now. They've gone through a military coup for a while. They actually had a female leader for a while, Benazir Bhutto. The United States has become friendly with Pakistan for a couple of reasons. One, this is where we've got some of those fundamentalist terrorist training camps are in through here, and so that is a threat. And so we're trying to work with Pakistan to get rid of them. Also, that ongoing war in Afghanistan, this becomes a staging area and a way to get into Pakistan. So the United States has been trying to be friendly with them, and we want to build a pipeline to get through Afghanistan and through Pakistan to access that Central Asian oil. Sorry, I'm laughing. Cricket always makes me laugh because it's the craziest sport where it goes for 2 days. They have tea breaks. They score of 150 to 17 is considered close. And I've tried to watch it a million times. I just can't figure it out. But if somebody wants to find a way to make cricket interesting for me, send me the link and I'd be more than happy to figure it out. Bangladesh, remember they got their independence in 1971? They were, of the 3 countries, they were the one that had the least economic development. So it's not surprising that poverty is rampant through here. The other problem with Bangladesh is this area down and through here is a giant river delta. So when the Ganges floods, it floods the river delta. So this is a constant problem. They had a hurricane that hit a couple of years ago that came across this very low-lying area, and it killed tens of thousands of people because it is in such a physically precarious area. But on the bright side, this is one of the governments that said we will have these positions in our government for women. This is basically twice the rate it is in the United States for our federal government of the number of women in elected positions. There's a Ganges. This picture, when we talk about climate change, this one's the one that always scares me because a few feet change in sea level is going to displace tens of millions of Bangladeshis. Those tens of millions of Bangladeshis are going to go and spill over into India. This is where I think we're going to see the first global problem of climate change on a massive scale, because those tens of millions of people going into India could disrupt the world's largest democracy. We had 1 million migrants come from the Middle East and into Europe in the past couple of years, and look what it's done to the Europeans. They're all freaking out. Their turnover in governments, and Europe's one of the richest areas on earth, and they couldn't handle the impact of 1 million. I can't imagine what tens of millions going into India would do and to destabilize that government, but hopefully we'll see. Now, what do you do for iron when you're a poor country? And iron is needed for construction. So you just buy used ships, you break them apart, melt the metal, and there you go. That's your source. It's called ship breaking. So all the old ships that are no longer in service, no longer efficient, they're too expensive to retrofit. The companies in India and Bangladesh will buy them, tear them apart, and recycle just about everything they can. Now, remember, they don't have the same labor laws we do. They don't have the same safety. So it's frightening what happens in these areas where they tear apart the ships. Here you can see it. This is a recent picture of Chittagong and all the ships that are being dismantled here in the water. This one, it's not a great photo, but there's oil leaks. So, I mean, there's oil leaks, there's fuel leaks, there's asbestos. It's frightening. I have a ship-breaking video on Canvas. I encourage you to watch it. It's kind of scary what happens at these places, but this is, what do you do? I mean, if they didn't have this, well, they couldn't afford to get oil, iron on the open market any other way. I'm not going to touch on Sri Lanka. I left this in here just as one of those stories that I talked about for years, the ongoing conflict with the Sinhalese and Tamils. It's just nice that they're not fighting anymore. But it was that typical, you had a smaller group that wanted equal rights and they fought for it and got it over time. The tsunami in 2004 hit this area pretty hard, and this was when we knew that the Civil War was almost over, because both sides agreed to a peace to stop fighting until they could get everything rebuilt and they could work together to help those that were affected by the tsunami. And when we talk about Indonesia, we'll see another group that's rebelling against the government that didn't do that, and so that was not a good sign. But the fact that they were going to put down their arms to help rebuild, I thought that was a good sign in 2004. And sure enough, it led to their peace. Our last two countries in South Asia, Nepal and Bhutan, they're kind of fun. Nepal had a long civil war, some mild unrest. It's the reason anybody hears about Nepal anymore is simply because this is how you access the climbing in the Himalayas. China's kind of limited it, and everybody goes through Nepal. It's just beautiful. And no, I don't even think I'm going to put Nepal on the quiz. And there's Dr. Salutin. Now, Bhutan fascinates me. There's King Wangchuck. He's no longer the king, but it's King Wangchuck and his four queens. Everybody Wangchuck tonight. This is a Buddhist country with a very strong central government, unitary. Remember I said that we talked about Russia and the United States, that there's a federal system where you've got lots of powers allocated locally, and a unitary system where the power is in one place. And here it sits with the king. He actually wanted the population to decide if he should be king. So they had an election in 2008 that said, should I be the king anymore? And the population overwhelmingly said, yes, you should be. And the person who was running against him didn't even want to run because they didn't want him to not be king. And it's not that they were afraid of him. It's just that's the society is geared towards it. Now he stepped down and his son took over. I can't pronounce his name, but he's now the new king. They had a recognition of, you know what, we don't have a lot of economic development. We don't have a lot of exports. So if you look at any economic charts, Bhutan always ranks really, really low. But Bhutan was like, well, that's not how you should measure us. That's not how you should measure our society. Are the people happy? So the concept of gross national happiness kind of came out of Bhutan. And there are groups that have measures that's not uniform, but the gross national happiness, I thought, well, that's a nice way to look at a society. It's not how rich, how poor they are. It's, how happy is the population. And apparently they're not unhappy. They can't get tobacco there. All right, see you guys later. Good night from South India. Next time we'll see you in Southeast Asia.